The treatment of refugees and immigrants and the Kemalist authorities, and the treatment of refugees and immigrants and the AKP political elites is the topic of today's video. Welcome to Radio Rebellion. Let's start. As I already mentioned in previous videos, community concepts or visions of communities always have direct repercussions on the treatment of minorities, immigrants, and refugees. Obviously. Now, what does this mean for the treatment of immigrants and the Kemalist authorities? I will explain in a minute, but first let me tell you that at the time of the Kemalist rule, the modern Turkish Republic was founded in 1923. The concept of refugee as it exists today didn't exist at the time. But what did exist was a settlement law, and in this settlement law, it was being stated that only people that are connected to Turkish culture or who speak Turkish or who are Muslims, they can settle within a nation, within the borders of the Turkish nation, okay? So according to this definition, to the settlement law, those people were allowed to settle within the borders of the Turkish nation. Otherwise, they needed at least to be assimilatable. Thus, they needed to be able to learn the Turkish language, of course, or they needed to be assimilatable. There's nothing to explain here. This is also the reason why they preferred the immigration of Muslims over non-Muslims, and this is actually a bit tricky to understand for people who are not familiar with contemporary or with modern Turkish history, because the concept of the modern Turkish state is that it is a secular state, but they understood that the cultural code of the nation on the ground, or of the majority of the people who are living within the borders of their nation, is a religious cultural code, and that social cohesion was imagined through the uniting bond of Islam. Or social cohesion, in other words, was created through religion. This is what they understood, even though they were promoting an authoritarian secularism, but they were smart, let's say, and they understood that, and this is why, in order to make the nation more governable, or to better govern the nation, they only allowed the immigration of Muslims, because they knew that otherwise it would be even more complicated for them to govern this nation. Okay. The aim of Kemalist authorities who founded the modern Turkish nation was to keep their nation as homogeneous as possible, religiously homogeneous and ethnically homogeneous. Thus people, if they were not of the same faith, they ideally should convert, but people that were not of the same faith were usually not even allowed. But people who were not of the same ethnicity, they had to be assimilated. Yeah, my dear friends and listeners, what else is there to say? Yeah, they wanted to protect the nation from ethnic and religious impurity. I have touched upon this already. And I think we covered it all. Now, what were the exceptions that have been made? Some Kurds, they were allowed. Kurds that were not living within the borders of the Turkish nation, they were allowed to immigrate. Okay, as long as they learn Turkish culture and learn Turkish language. Albanians from the Balkans, many Albanians were allowed to immigrate, or even they were exchanged with non-Muslims living within the country. there were population exchanges taking place to make the nation more homogeneous, more governable. And many people from the Balkans have been taken in, Muslims from the Balkans, and they were made familiar with Turkish culture. And other Turkish folks, for example, other people that seemed assimilable to Turkish culture for the authorities of the time were Pomaks, Bosnians, Tartars, but also Muslims, other Muslims, Georgians, Chechens, Circassians, Abkhazians, and so on and so forth, or Bulgarian Turks. So all of these folks were allowed in because they seemed assimilable, and they were allowed to settle within the borders of the Turkish nation. Now, the AKP government is under more pressure because of the EU accession negotiations to change these very restrictive and discriminatory immigration laws. This is why the European authorities assisted Turkish officials to draft an immigration law, the Law on Foreigners' International Protection, that is more open, less discriminatory, inclusive, and not based on cultural Turkishness. This has also been, how do you say in English? This has also been accepted, officially ratified, but again, the implementation of this law is less than sincere, as we will see in what I will going to say now. Actually, the Law on Foreigners' International Protection has been considered, many European authorities, European officials, they said they could observe remarkable human rights developments, or, they could see huge improvements when it comes to human rights in this law. But again, as I already mentioned, it didn't get implemented, and the authorities there continue to implement the laws according to their own, according to it's fit with their community vision of community. But I have to say, my dear friends and listeners, this is the case everywhere. I worked on the ground in Italy and in Austria, and I saw that immigration laws, to some extent, get applied everywhere, in accordance with the national definition of identity. To some extent. It might be more in Turkey, of course, but let's not be naive. It's the case everywhere to some extent. Not that I want to excuse, the treatment of foreigners, refugees, immigrants, but I also just try to compare and contrast a little bit. What else? Yes, it also has to be mentioned. Of course, I forgot to say that Turkey, of course, securitizes that many immigrants, refugees, because of its geopolitical position. It indeed has a difficult position. It's located between East and West, and, it's not an easy geographical position to be in. I need to also say this myself. Again, this is not an excuse, but it's a challenging point. But what changed in the treatment of immigrants and refugees from the Kemalists to the AKP government is that, they highlight, as I already mentioned in another video, they highlight religion, they highlight ethnicity, and AKP highlights religion, again, more in the vision of community, and this is also has repercussions on the treatment of immigrants. Now, under this community concept, here, definition of a refugee didn't exist, and they knew that religion played a role for the social cohesion on the ground. This is why they let religious Muslim people in. But for them, ethnicity was really what was actually important. But okay, the definition of a refugee didn't exist, so you know. But now it does exist, and for them, this plays a huge role for who we admit as refugees or who we do not admit. So this is why under this community concept, many Sunni Muslims, they obviously have an advantage over non-Sunni Muslims. This is also why that many Sunni Muslims, they crossed over to Europe after the Syrian civil war. They have been accepted in Turkey, while, for example, Shia Kurds, Shias from Iraqi Shias who were looking for asylum in Turkey, or Iranians, and so on and so forth, like they have it much more difficult to get asylum there, not only because of the AKP's vision of community, but also because officially it is a fact that in Turkey ratified the Geneva Refugee Convention with a geographical limitation clause. That means they only consider officially people from Europe who are individually persecuted in Europe as refugees. And the Syrians, they have been admitted in Turkey on communal grounds. This was a larger refugee crisis, so one needs to distinguish. But overall, they obviously prefer people, immigrants, refugees, who, fit into their vision of community. So in summary, Turkish authorities apply the new immigration laws in accordance with their definition of national identity, and they prefer Sunni Islam over other Muslims, and they support with their decisions, they support, of course, in-group trust, and they do not force the out-group trust towards non-religious minorities, groups, individuals, etc. Yeah, so this was it for today. I hope it was interesting. I hope to see you soon. Bye bye.